Hi, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of our Weatherhead East Asian Institute lunch series. And we have a wonderful speaker today, Tyler Jost, who's at Brown University, about his new book that came out recently. Um, and I'm going to ask Tom Christensen to say a few words because Tyler is an alumnus not only of Harvard's PhD program, but of the Tom Christensen's China and the World program, which is a program that has been around for 20 years, 21 years, and has had as postdocs in his program everybody who is anybody in the field of Chinese foreign policy and international relations, and that includes Tyler. So we're recording this session and so that we could put it up on our YouTube channel, but we won't be putting the Q&A part on the YouTube channel. So those of you who ask questions later on, you won't be put up on the public thing. Those who are participating remotely, you have the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So when we get to Q&A, you can enter your questions and comments there. So now let me ask Tom to say a few words. So Tom originally was going to moderate this thing, then he was going to be away and couldn't moderate it, and I was assigned to moderate it, and now he's actually able to be here. But I refuse to give up my privilege as the moderator, so I'm still here. But Tom.
I just wanted to say a few words about this event. It's a second event in China and the World. We're cooperating with the Weatherhead East Asia Institute for this event. We're really proud to do so because we have one of our star former fellows, Tyler Jost, who is at Brown University. He will present his excellent book, which I have read extremely carefully, along with a lot of his other works on China's foreign relations, China's domestic politics. But our program has always tried to emphasize that we're trying to encourage scholars to be both China specialists and general scholars of theory and social science, whether it be political science, sociology, law, or anything else. And Tyler is a great example of that because he's really mastered the field of international relations theory in addition to his true expertise in China. And he came to the program from Harvard, where he got his PhD with my co-conspirator of creating the China and the World program, Alistair Ian Johnston. Before that, he was a U.S. Army officer, a West Point grad, who himself was an intelligence officer. So one of the things we try to do at China and the World is to bridge the fields of academia and real world policy. And Tyler is yet another prime example of someone whose life and work bridges that gap. So I just wanted to say a few words and turn it back over to our true moderator, never to be supplanted. Andy, my advisor.
All right. So Tyler, then over to you.
Great. Let's see if I can do this successfully. Okay, and then I'm going to full screen here somehow. How do I do that? There we go. And yeah, that should work. Okay. Thanks so much. Oh, is it now? Okay. Terrific. Okay, well, thank you so much, Andy and Tom, for having me. It's a pleasure to be back here. I think this was the same room that when I was a fellow in the China and the World program, I first presented this in dissertation format I'd recently defended. That gives me a bit of shell shock because I made the mistake in the Q&A. Tom asked a question, and as usual, Tom was right about everything. I made the mistake of using the example of something that had happened in the 1958 Taiwan Straits crisis, which for those of you who are familiar with Tom's first book, Useful Adversaries, one of the key chapters is on the kind of domestic politics of that crisis. And so like Tom and I actually got into a bit of a sparring match. Of course, I lost, but hopefully the sort of outcome of things today will be a bit different or better. But there's a kind of interesting parallel here because as Tom was saying, this is a presentation based upon a book that came out with Cambridge University Press last year called Bureaucracies at War. And the motivation of that book is that international conflicts often turn out much differently than the leaders who launch them think that they will. And as a kind of illustration of this, consider, there we go. The early months of 1979, when China's national leaders approved a short but very powerful invasion of their southern neighbor, Vietnam. Now, the strategic logic of this invasion was rather simple. China would teach its southern neighbor a lesson through a short-lived invasion that would demonstrate China's military prowess, akin to what China had done to India in 1962. And then China would withdraw its forces back across the border, having achieved this intended effect. But unfortunately for China, the war ended up having the exact opposite effect in the minds of decision makers in Hanoi. Poor performance on the battlefield by the People's Liberation Army demonstrated China's military weakness as opposed to its strength. And as Vietnamese leaders we now know were saying in private shortly after the war, from their perspective, it was not China who taught Vietnam a lesson, but rather Vietnam who had taught China a lesson. So this kind of rather pat or simple distillation of the 1979 war illustrates an important and somewhat tragic point about the nature of war itself. And that is decision makers often charge headfirst into conflicts that ultimately fail to deliver the benefits that they anticipate. Indeed, the benefits that led them to initiate the conflict in the first place. And this mismatch between expectation and outcome often leads decision makers to question, with the benefit of hindsight, whether they might have made different decisions had a different set of information been available to them. In the context of U.S. escalation in Vietnam, for example, numerous senior officials would later reflect on just how inaccurate their picture of the situation was at the time. Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, in his memoirs famously claimed that the United States decision makers were, quote, wrong, terribly wrong. Similarly, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, in an unpublished manuscript that is similar to a memoir in draft form, it's available at the JFK archives in Boston, Massachusetts, put the point more precisely when he said that the spread of communism in Asia, essentially the precipitus for the United States escalation, quote, could have been contained just about as well as it was at much lower cost, end quote. So this leads to the central question of the book, which is, why do states miscalculate on the road to war? And as political scientists, historians, or just casual observers, we might immediately be drawn to the answer that while hindsight might be 20/20, a decision maker's view at the time is often quite blurry. And as a result, we might be tempted to conclude that given the pervasive nature of uncertainty in the international environment, what some refer to as the fog of war in the context of international conflict, sometimes things are going to go differently than what you expect, no matter what you do. But this book reaches a different conclusion. Some level of unanticipated failure is certainly unavoidable, but over time, states do better and worse depending on how they choose to design institutions for foreign policy decision-making. Some institutions perform better than others, the book argues, at delivering more complete and accurate information to leaders who get to choose between war and peace, and that shapes the patterns of conflict outcomes that we observe in the real world. So my argument centers on a particular set of formal and informal institutions that shape this propensity for miscalculation, I'm going to argue. Those regulating the relationship between leaders, think presidents, prime ministers, or even dictators, and their diplomatic, defense, and intelligence bureaucracy. This book is certainly not the first to discuss the role of bureaucracy in foreign policy decision-making. A long tradition dating back to Graham Allison's work in the early 1970s has explored this topic in detail. But I would posit that if there's a single conventional wisdom inherent in this body of work, it is that integrating bureaucracy into decision-making tends to muck things up. It degrades decision-making process and tends to deliver biased information to those leaders choosing between war and peace. Or, as the colloquial saying goes, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. And my argument here is that we have this quite wrong. Bureaucratic participation, I argue, in decision-making actually is quite helpful to avoiding miscalculation, particularly when institutions channeling this bureaucratic participation are properly designed. And this is essentially for two reasons. The first is that it expands information search beyond what any single human leader would be able to collect on their own. And then critically, putting bureaucrats with competing interests and perspectives in dialogue with one another, specifically defense and diplomatic bureaucracies, forces a kind of debate and deliberation that improves information quality to which the leader has access. Or then this sort of leads to the title of the book, Putting Bureaucracies at War at Home Helps to Prevent Miscalculation on the Road to Wars Abroad. Of course, this kind of contention that I'm making about institutions naturally raises a puzzle. If what I'm saying about institutional design is correct, why would leaders ever design anything but the most optimal institutions available? And I offer an answer in the book in the second half of the theoretical portion that is rooted in domestic politics, essentially arguing that there's a kind of trade-off that leaders face because the institutions that deliver high-quality information often empower bureaucracies to punish those leaders because it allows them to accumulate expertise, knowledge, access to information, which can be potentially used to punish that leader politically. So leaders resolve this trade-off based upon their domestic political environment. In situations in which leaders perceive the bureaucratic state as threatening their political survival, they tend to adopt institutions that might be inefficient from the perspective of decision-making, but nonetheless are efficient from the perspective of politics. So putting these two things together, what we get is essentially an argument in which the domestic and political environment pushes leaders in certain situations towards pathological bureaucratic institutions, which can raise the risk of miscalculation over time. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to talk about three parts of the book. The first is the institutional theory of miscalculation, that first tenet of the theory that I talked to you about, and then we'll get a little bit in the empirics into the second component, the political theory of institutional design. I'll give a brief overview of the case studies holistically, because this is a book that draws on 4 case countries, China, India, Pakistan, and the United States, as well as some cross-national data across or outside of those countries. And then I'm going to focus in particular on some cases from the book that look at how institutions changed in the 1960s in China based upon institutional design choices that the leader at that time, Mao Zedong, made in response to domestic political incentives, which had pretty significant consequences for the quality of information available to him on the eve of the 1969 Sino-Soviet border conflict. So let's start with the theory. The book begins with this kind of stylized idea of a leader. Here it's John F. Kennedy, but we can imagine it's sort of any political leader in office with the authority to choose between conflict and peace, looking out at the world and sort of contemplating whether or not they should initiate some sort of international confrontation with another country. The leader could see this confrontation as a pathway to help them advance their interests, but all else equal, they would prefer to avoid the cost of confrontation if the conflict doesn't ultimately advance those interests. Essentially, what you have here is a kind of prediction problem about the probable costs and benefits of the confrontation that the leader is contemplating. And miscalculation in this framework occurs when leaders choose a strategy based upon an inaccurate assessment about one of those basic parameters. Now, when performing this prediction task, leaders could make the decision entirely on their own, right? It could be a sort of like this picture would suggest, by themselves in the Oval Office or in the depths of Zhongnanhai in Beijing. But leaders also have another option, which is that they can lean on subordinates inside of the state, that is their bureaucracy. Now, this choice about how leaders choose to structure their relationship to the bureaucracy becomes an analytical centerpiece for the book, a typology of 4 institutional arrangements. And in this part of the argument, it's helpful to perhaps emphasize that what I'm trying to accomplish is to provide those of us who study international politics with a framework and in some way just a language to think systematically about differences that exist between bureaucratic structures across time and space, whether that's China in the 1960s or the United States today. We already have the ability to speak in this way about other key domestic institutions. Think about the difference between autocracy and democracy, i.e., how leaders are selected for office. But when we come to bureaucratic politics, while Graham Allison's work was incredibly generative back in the 70s, it didn't necessarily leave us with the ability to say, well, China possessed a certain type of bureaucratic structure in year A or year B. Now, this typology, and it's not the only way in which you could typologize bureaucratic structure, but it posits that there are two really fundamental dimensions to this relationship between political leaders and bureaucrats. The first dimension pertains to the capacity to assist leaders in searching for information within the state. And the second dimension pertains to the capacity to share information across bureaucratic organizations within that same state. And in Cartesian terms, if this is helpful to you, you could think about these institutions as enabling, in the first dimension, vertical information flow up from the bureaucracy to the leader, and then in the second dimension, horizontally across different bureaucratic organizations, or as we'll get to in a second, silos. We can think about each of these dimensions along a continuum of high to low values. And of course, there could be intermediate values as well. And in the first dimension, institutions can either be inclusive, easing the cost of information flow from the bureaucracy up to the leader and vice versa, or they could be insular, raising those same costs. And this is the same is true for that second dimension. Institutions can be open, allowing information to flow freely across organizational boundaries, or they can be closed, imposing obstacles to horizontal sharing. Now, these two dimensions yield four institutional types, or a 2x2, which is kind of the, every theory in IR has to have a 2x2. But again, think about these essentially as bureaucratic analogs to describing a state at a given moment in time as either a democracy or autocracy. So in the next few slides, what I'm going to do is talk about the logic of each institutional type, beginning with integrated institutions, with an eye towards, okay, with a given institutional arrangement, what would this mean for the relative risk of miscalculation? Beginning with integrated institutions, the core claim here is that integrated institutions reduce the likelihood of miscalculation by supplying leaders with more complete and accurate information as they are choosing between peace and conflict. This is not to say that their information will be complete just because they have this type of institution. It's relative to other alternatives that I'm going to come to in a second. But the intuition behind this is essentially that there are transaction costs associated with searching for information within a state. Just because the bureaucracy contains a certain bit of information does not necessarily mean that that bit of information will make its way up to a leader who needs to make a consequential foreign policy choice. And this is true even when the leader has the power and the authority to compel that bureaucracy. The leaders still need tools to be able to reach into the state and pull out the information that they need in a given moment in time. And so in the book, I argue that leaders have a set of formal and informal rules at their disposal that could theoretically lower these information search costs. One helpful way of thinking about this, if it's helpful, or illustrating this, is a leader's advisory body, such as the National Security Council. So we might be tempted to think about these as a kind of peculiarity or oddity of the United States. The United States has the NSC. Maybe that's just a US phenomenon, but actually these are quite pervasive across the world, particularly today. So for example, here you have a meeting of the National Security Council in Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek's son, Jiang Jingguo. And the existence of these bodies, the appointments of bureaucratic representatives on such bodies, as well as commitments to use these bodies, all establish these kind of formal and informal rules that would lower information search costs and getting bureaucracies, affording opportunities to bureaucrats to relay information to the leader. But the second part of the logic of an integrated institution is that leaders want to be able to design these institutions in ways that naturally facilitate deliberation. After all, one of the core conventional wisdoms of that camel is a horse designed by a committee intuition is that the bureaucratic politics model predicts bureaucracies have parochial ways or biased ways of viewing the world, which means that as you increase their access, it's likely that based upon the traditional conventional wisdom, you're going to get more information flowing, but it could be inaccurate. So I argue that integration of two key bureaucratic constituencies helps to overcome these biases, at least at the margins. And that is specifically diplomatic and defense ministries. And the logic here is that putting these two ministries in dialogue is kind of helpful for leaders in two ways. The first is a kind of functional approach to the problem. And it's just the simple fact that diplomatic and defense ministries focus on different types or different parts of the world, or different parts of the problem, rather, is probably a better way of saying it, as leaders are potentially collecting information on the road to war. Diplomatic ministries and work by Rob Shub has shown this systematically in the context of the United States, but they have information about the adversary's political will and resolve, which could shape the leader's estimates of the likelihood that an adversary would be willing to pay costs on the battlefield rather than make concessions. Defense ministries, on the other hand, have unique information about the other side's material capabilities, the balance of power, which can shape a leader's projection of how costly conflict might be and the probability of a successful outcome. So that's kind of one set of reasons why this diplomatic defense dialogue, for theoretical reasons, might work. The second reason is that diplomatic and defense ministries tend to have quite for reasons of selection or socialization, different ways of viewing the world. And so in other words, I actually show that defense ministries, for example, tend to be filled with individuals who display more hawkish attitudes about the world. That is, they tend to emphasize the efficacy and appropriateness of using violence to solve international disputes. Diplomatic ministries, on the other hand, tend to exhibit less hawkish attitudes, emphasizing efficacy and appropriateness of things like diplomatic engagement. And so the logic of integrated institutions, pardon me. So logic of integrated institutions is that this competitive dialogue allows, or at least encourages, each side not only to complement one another's information, as was the case in that first reason I gave, but also to set up deliberative interactions in which each side is naturally situated to poke holes in the other side's arguments. So members of Eisenhower's National Security Council, visualized here, referred to this as a kind of acid bath that information had to pass through as it was presented to the president. And there's a strategic logic here as well, right? So just like those of us who go through peer review know that our work is going to be scrutinized, advisors who are presenting information to the leader here know that other advisors are going to be able to pick apart their claims. And so in that scenario, individuals might, or advisors might act strategically, being less willing to offer information that they know is clearly false. So let's move on and talk about the logic of siloed and fragmented institution, but at a slightly faster clip, because these are in many ways an inverse of what we see in integrated institutions. So the claim the book makes regarding siloed and fragmented institutions is that these arrangements both raise the risk of miscalculation by supplying leaders with less complete and less accurate information as leaders decide between peace and conflict. Again, this is not an absolute claim. This is one relative to integrated setups. So in a siloed institution, again, think lots of vertical information flow, but minimal horizontal information flow. The rules essentially make it easy for bureaucrats to pass information up, but that kind of competitive dialogue between various bureaucratic organizations doesn't kick in. And this poses two problems to the accuracy of information that leaders over time receive. The first is that bureaucrats, as I just said, can't poke holes in peers' information if they don't have access to it. So the lack of a direct dialogue and debate means that leaders are left with only their personal judgment to adjudicate between completing claims, all of which could be a little bit more biased at the margins. And second, building on that strategic dimension that I just referenced, because bureaucrats know that the other side is not going to be there to poke holes, they might be tempted to intentionally bias their information in ways that suit their parochial interests. So a helpful illustration of this logic actually comes from outside of China in Pakistan in the 1999 Kargil War. For those who are not familiar, in the early months of 1999, Pakistan quietly moved troops across the line of control between India and Pakistan, parts of disputed territory in Kashmir. And this action triggered a military retaliation by India and started the only war that has been fought between nuclear powers. What's so puzzling about the Kashmir War is that the initiator, Pakistan, really got very little in exchange for the tremendous amount of risk and cost they paid on the battlefield, not to, the least of which was the fact that they were going toe-to-toe with another nuclear country. The war failed to change the territory that Pakistan controlled in the area. Pakistan lost somewhere between 200 and 700 soldiers during the conflict. The war pushed India into a closer relationship with the United States. And most critically, the responsibility for the war's outcome became the centerpiece for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's political removal later that year in the fall. So this book essentially argues that contrary to the conventional wisdom, the Kargil War was not the result of autonomous military actions that the Chief of Army Staff made along the border. Sharif, the book tries to show empirically, was briefed along the way on the military operation at multiple points in the winter and spring of 1999. Instead, Sharif's problem was twofold. First, Sharif was desperately dependent upon advisors to understand the intricacies of the situation that he faced. As one of Sharif's senior officials told me during my field work in Pakistan, a leader's, quote, mind is made by his advisors. And here he's referring to Sharif in particular. Second, Sharif's advisory system was highly siloed between defense and diplomatic wings. Bureaucratic structure afforded both the foreign and defense ministries access to Sharif, but they had few mechanisms to force information sharing between them, and these would often occur in like separate venues. As a result, while there were dissidents within the foreign ministry that were skeptical of any such military gambit, there was also similar information available in the intelligence wing as well. Limits on the foreign ministers and foreign secretaries' knowledge meant that they essentially didn't know how much Sharif needed the information that they had at their disposal or dissenting analysis that they might provide until it was too late. So lastly, the book makes this claim, a very similar claim regarding fragmented institutions, also raising the risk of miscalculation by supplying incomplete and inaccurate information, but according to a somewhat different logic. So in a fragmented institution, essentially imagine we're sort of back in square one. Where we have a leader making decisions on their own because they're putting up systematic barriers, not just to horizontal information flow, but to vertical information flow as well. And if the theory's core contention is right, this should raise the risk of miscalculation for essentially two reasons. First, it means that the leaders only have access to information that they can collect personally, which suggests that there might be gaps in what they what they know about the situation they face. And second, there are some reasons to think that a fragmented design could actually work even worse than if the leader was theoretically able to sort of decide on their own, because the bureaucrats that remain behind are incentivized to seek out information that confirms the leader's prior beliefs. In other words, the institutional design itself serves as a kind of signal about the types of advice that the leader is willing to tolerate, and in short, they become sycophants. We might think about this as strictly a function of what Jessica Weeks or others have termed personalist dictatorships, but the book tries to show that this institutional arrangement is not only empirically prevalent among a number of different countries, but actually that it can happen a number of different autocracies. Or types of autocracies, but it can actually occur in even institutionalized democracies as well. Specifically, there's a chapter on the United States, which makes the case that a series of changes to the National Security Council under Lyndon Johnson made the U.S. system a remarkably fragmented system, particularly in comparison to the administrations that had preceded it under Eisenhower and Kennedy. And to try to illustrate this, let me show you a couple, one plot from the book that tries to quantify this change between Eisenhower and Kennedy on the one hand and Johnson on the other. So here you have data that is collected from the presidential daily diaries. These are essentially daily logs of all the meetings that a president had in a given day. And it's nice because they have start and end time, so you can catalog or count the number of hours that presidents spent dealing with certain types of advisors. And one really key thing that happens in the Johnson administration, the other plots show that sort of Johnson moves out of the NSC structure into more informal settings, in particular this thing called the Tuesday luncheon. But this is a pretty dramatic effect on both the intelligence, here we go, both the intelligence and military wings access, right? So look at the light gray box plot on the far right of both of these columns. You see much lower in comparison to what we saw under Eisenhower and Kennedy. So lower level individuals from the bureaucracy being pushed out. Did this have an effect? Well, one way of trying to figure this out is by looking at accounts of advisors who were on the losing end of that institutional redesign. One example here is this NSC staffer who was in charge of Vietnam, named Chester Cooper. It's very rare that individuals in a memoir would talk in strictly counterfactual terms. But as a social scientist, you're sort of like very pleasantly surprised when they do. And so here he uses this, this short story from American literature in the mid-20th century, James Thurber, the story of Walter Mitty, this kind of middling, I think he's originally a salesman, but in his day-to-day activities, he daydreams about being, a firefighter or a spy or president of the United States, so on and so forth. And he would describe interactions that Cooper would describe his own interactions in exactly these terms when he would get access to Johnson. And again, he's mostly shut out of the room, but when he does get access to him, Johnson had this ritual of going around the room and saying, Mr. X, do you agree? Mr. Y, do you agree? Mr. Z, do you agree? It was all basically men at that point, actually. Cooper, in his heart of hearts, has this Mitty-like fantasy where he rises up and says, no, Mr. President, I do not agree. But when he comes to him, and Cooper directly links this to the institutional choices that Johnson had made, he finds himself falsifying what he tells the president. A pretty radical admission for a person who had advised the president on the most consequential choice of the Cold War from the US perspective, arguably. Okay, so now I want to try to illustrate the way that this theory works in application. First, by talking a little bit about the case studies holistically, and then specifically talking about the case of China that will provide a kind of illustration for us. So the book, as I said before, draws upon 4 case countries: China, India, Pakistan, and the United States. And here, one of the empirical goals of the book is to try to unpack foreign policy decision-making in country contexts that we don't normally consider in studying bureaucratic politics and IR. This literature dating back to Graham's work in the 1970s, the empirics were largely drawn from the United States and to a certain extent Western Europe. But here I'm interested in how we can open up the black box in other countries as well. These specific countries outside of the United States, China, India, and Pakistan, were essentially chosen for 3 reasons. First, they have the full range of sort of regime types in the world, the other major domestic institutions that IR theorists say is important. So here we have presidential and parliamentary democracies, as well as personalist, collectivist, and military dictatorships. Second, there's institutional variation and the dimensions that I'm interested in, even within a single regime type. So you get China, for example, going from integrated institutions to fragmented institutions, and in that case, actually under the same leader, as I'll show in a second. And the third reason is the richness of the data. So in some cases, such as China and India, archival records were organized in a way that facilitated construction of descriptive like quantitative measures similar to the one that I just showed you in the United States. And in other cases, such as Pakistan, there was just unusually open access to senior decision makers to be interviewed that were involved in some of the most important miscalculations of Pakistan's history. So in the remaining time, I'm going to use the case of institutional changes in China during the 1960s to illustrate the theoretical contentions of the book. And to preview, there's essentially 3 things that I'm going to try to show in this case. The first is that there's a pretty dramatic shift in the threat that Mao perceives from the foreign policy bureaucracy beginning in the early 1960s as he's beginning to contemplate his succession. The second is that the threat led Mao to shift from an integrated design to a fragmented one. And finally, that the shift helps explain some of China's miscalculations in the late 1960s. Now, to show this, I'm going to draw upon essentially four types of data. The first will be about the nature of the political environment, whether the leaders saw the bureaucracy as a threat to their agenda. The second is about the formal and informal properties of the institution. And on the formal side, I'm going to be interested in organizational records that give us insight into which bureaucracies had access to the leader. And on the informal side, I'm interested in how leaders actually utilize these bodies, or whether they even did, structuring opportunities for bureaucrats to share information with the leader and one another. Lastly, we're interested here in drawing inferences about how these institutional choices shape the leader's decision-making. And here it's important to emphasize that we want to be especially cautious, because just because leaders chose a strategy that did not work or made a projection that proved to be inaccurate does not necessarily mean that the institutional design was to blame. Again, like the starting point for the presentation was like, sometimes things go wrong and there's nothing you can do about it. So the empirical standard here for an institutional miscalculation requires observing 3 things. The first is that the leaders of the view of the situation proved to be inaccurate, with the benefit of a historian's view in retrospect. Second, that the information contrary to the leader's assessment was available within the system at the time that the leader was making the decision. And third, the reason the information failed to reach the leader stemmed from higher transaction costs or strategic incentives to represent within the bureaucracy. In other words, we want evidence similar to what Chester Cooper wrote in his memoirs, suggesting that bureaucrats tried and failed to get information to the leader, or their admission that they deliberately chose to withhold information because they feared political punishment. So let's start with the case of China and Mao's early political environment. As everyone knows, as everyone in this room likely knows, Mao enjoys an absolute political power at the time the PRC is established in 1949, based upon firsthand accounts, as well as the just sort of the facts of what happened in Yan'an and the rectification campaign, as well as his charismatic leadership over the party in his early years. It makes it arguably unthinkable that Mao could have really been seriously challenged politically at this moment in time. And this leaves Mao with a generally low perceived threat from the foreign policy bureaucracy for the first decade of roughly the first decade of his rule. And as late as the summer of 1962, Mao notes internally that he's actually quite pleased with the loyalty of both the foreign ministry as well as the People's Liberation Army. The domestic political environment was associated with a comparatively integrated institutional design. Again, we might think of this as perhaps a little puzzling, given the way that some people describe Mao's general political rule. Again, it's a dictatorship. Some would argue it's a personalized dictatorship. But along this dimension, we get both formally and informally several signs of integration. So on the formal side, here is more organizational membership of one of the key advisory bodies, the Politburo. If we look at the Central Military Commission, we get something that's quite similar. And here included are both representative of the foreign and defense ministries during the PRC's early years. Another indication of integration is a series of subordinate coordination bodies, such as the Secretariat and leading small groups, which actually existed as early as the 1950s, to try to establish horizontal information sharing as well. Informally, because of course, just because these things existed on paper didn't mean they had any effect, records released by the CCP show that there was actually pretty routine access to Mao, even after the Great Leap Forward begins in 1958. We know now that these included dozens of reports from lower level advisors on international and defense affairs. And we now know that Mao actually actively encouraged the bureaucracy to share information at this moment in time. So in an instruction from Mao to Defense Minister Peng Dehuai and Chief of General Staff, Huang Kecheng in 1953, he wrote, quote, "There should be an outline of the Central Military Commission, China's primary military wing, once or twice every month," end quote, provided to the Politburo. We can see this kind of quantitatively when we look at these chronicles of leader activities, roughly analogous to the presidential daily diaries in the United States, which catalog leaders' activities in a given day. So here you have an example of Mao sharing a Politburo meeting in 1962, as well as informal meetings that happened, in this case, in July 1958. If we and in a second, we can sort of look at how this played out quantitatively, but we'll get to that when we come to the 1969 case. So the 1962 mainland invasion scare, this period of the spring and summer of 1962, in which the KMT began to really seriously contemplate some sort of military action against the mainland, is a helpful way of illustrating how integrated designs worked reasonably well as Mao was contemplating a potential international conflict. And so the story essentially goes like this. In the spring of 1962, Chiang Kai-shek, the individual depicted here, began planning for this major military operation targeting the mainland. It was probably more serious than things he was contemplating in the 1950s. He writes in his diary, quote, that there was clear proof of support that the Chinese regime on the mainland was waning. He also writes that 1962 was, quote, his only favorable opportunity, end quote, for an offensive to take back control of the country. Chiang establishes a series of bodies, such as the National Recovery Operations Office, as well as the Battlefield Administration Bureau, and begins holding meetings with his inner military circle, all of which are sort of now, you can get a glimpse of based upon the archives that are open in Taipei. Mao's decision-making is really interesting here because he receives early warning that these develops are happening through military intelligence channels, and he immediately tasks the bureaucracy to start drawing up plans and assessments. So there's a debate within the Politburo, the Central Military Commission, as well as the Strategic Research Small Group. Both foreign ministry and defense advisors participate in these deliberations, and they sort of arrive at a two-pronged strategy. The first is that there would be a PLA mobilization to deter a KMT invasion, and second, the PRC would diplomatically engage the United States to tease out its intention. And this second component is actually really critical because information within China's foreign ministry played a very vital role in arriving at this conclusion. And this was for a couple of reasons. So first, individuals embedded in the foreign ministry noted that an invasion was unlikely if the United States did not approve, based upon the way that the Mutual Defense Treaty between Taiwan and the United States was structured. So Kennedy, of course, at this time was, in the foreign ministry's assessment, unlikely to have an appetite for such an operation because of the 1961 Bay of Pigs. Again, remember, this is only probably just about a year after the attempted invasion of Cuba. And as such, as Foreign Minister Cheney notes at the time, it would be more likely, or it was more likely, that, quote, Chiang Kai-shek has ignored U.S. restraints, end quote, and that Kennedy would not dare take the risk in actuality. So as a result, the foreign ministry encourages diplomatic engagement with the United States to gauge U.S. willingness to support a KMT attack. So the key here is not that the foreign ministry was necessarily pushing an engagement agenda. Here they were just sort of saying that there's some indication to believe that the United States is not going to support this. Let's get even more information to try to tease that out. The PRC Foreign Ministry representative in Warsaw, Wang Bingnan, meets with U.S. Ambassador John Cabot on June 23rd. And during that meeting, Wang receives a message that the United States, quote, had no intention of supporting a KMT attack. And on this side, you actually see the record from the Chinese Foreign Ministry archives recounting this meeting. We have the same or a complementary record from the U.S. archives as well. And here you see what is essentially the CC line of that cable back. So this is from Warsaw back to Beijing, all the individuals who this was shared with. And basically, this is like the greatest hits list of the 1960s or early 1960s, right? So you have information not just going up to Mao, but essentially the entire national security bureaucracy inside of the state. According to Wang Bingnan, that ambassador I just drew attention to, this, quote, had a major effect on decision-making at the time, and overall Mao's choices during the crisis become based on this information that's supplied to him by a bureaucratic process afforded by a relatively stable domestic political environment. So now let's compare this to the period after the year of 1962, and around the time at which Mao begins to contemplate his own death. And what the party will do after that critical juncture. As Mao put the problem in the summer of 1962, quote, what will happen after I die, end quote. The conclusions that Mao draws in contemplating his own mortality are informed by domestic political events over the last a couple of years. Namely, Mao takes the events of the Great Leap Forward as a premonition that the party would become less revolutionary after he was no longer with them. And as a result, beginning in the fall of 1962 and with elevated clip over the coming months and years, the party as the party approaches the launch of the Cultural Revolution, Mao increasingly sees the bureaucracy as a threat to his legacy and the Chinese Revolution writ large. We see this in Mao's frequent discussion of revisionism within the party. In May 1963, for example, Mao expresses concern that China will lose its revolutionary color. In October of that same year, he notes that, quote, measures must be taken, end quote, to curb against the risk of such internal changes. Moreover, what is unique about Mao's domestic threat perceptions in the mid-1960s is that he sees an international dimension to the fading revolutionary flavor of the regime or color of the regime, likely affected in some way by the ideological competition between China and the Soviet Union at the time. This puts the foreign affairs bureaucracy squarely in Mao's sights as early as the fall of 1962 in ways that they simply hadn't been in the past. As early as that fall, Mao commented in internal memoranda to the foreign ministry that diplomats need to pay attention to the, quote, connection between revisionism at home and abroad, end quote. And during the Three Wings campaign that fall, Mao targets one particular Chinese diplomat, this individual here, Wang Jiaxiang, up until that point, the head of the ILD. And the first of the foreign affairs bureaucracy to be caught up in the politics of succession. Wang is purged at this time, and it is, of course, an understatement to state that Wang's fate is nothing in comparison to what happened to many other diplomats, intelligence officials, and even military officers during the Cultural Revolution. So I said a second ago that we can use those Nianpu data or chronicle data to try to get at patterns in how Mao's changing approach to institutions play out over time in a kind of a more systematic way. So first, what we see here, and this is the left-hand panel, Mao shifts decision-making from the more inclusive Politburo to the more exclusive Politburo Standing Committee, in which there is no diplomatic representation. So this institutional choice, as you can see in the right-hand panel, has a really important effect on bureaucratic access to the leader. In this figure, we see a major drop in the access of China's bureaucrats in the 3-year period between the Great Leap Forward and the launch of the Cultural Revolution. And this drop essentially reaches a non-existent level during the tumult of the first 3 years of the Cultural Revolution itself. The winnowing connective tissue between Mao and the foreign affairs team is institutionalized through a series of choices in the mid-1960s. Mao establishes a Cultural Revolution group that replaces the Politburo temporarily. He removes senior leadership from the foreign ministry, including Foreign Minister Chen Yi himself, without assigning a replacement. And he dramatically curtails China's bureaucratic capacity writ large. Party organizational records suggest that roughly 70% of the foreign ministry personnel were sent down, that were stationed in Beijing, were sent down to the countryside to learn from the peasantry, and all but one Chinese ambassador was recalled to Beijing to participate in the Cultural Revolution. This has a really chilling effect on the foreign policy bureaucracy and their willingness to speak truth to power. CCP historian Zhang Baijia notes, for example, that after 1962, that when that individual I showed you a second ago, Wang Jiaxiang, was purged, Mao's subordinates, quote, did not dare suggest changes in Chinese foreign policy. Other firsthand accounts describe the bureaucracy as filled with sycophants aiming to please the higher-ups rather than, as we said before, speaking truth to power. Now, the events of 1969 that I've alluded to thus far, leading up to the Sino-Soviet border conflict, are a helpful illustration of the way that those institutional changes affected Mao's judgments and the information that was available to him at the time. So again, as a bit of background here, on March 2nd, 1969, Chinese forces stationed in Zhenbao Island along China's northeastern border launched this ambush on Soviet forces conducting a patrol there. Mao's choice here was based essentially on 3 assessments of the historical record seems to indicate. First, Mao seems to have believed that the Soviet Union would not escalate. On the contrary, Mao intimated that the attack would be viewed defensively by Moscow. As Mao put it, the, quote, Soviets know that we will not invade their country as it is so cold there, end quote. That's truly a quote. Mao really said that. Second, Mao believed that the Soviet Union was contemplating a preemptive attack on China. Orders from Beijing in 1967, for example, noted that the Soviet leadership had, quote, inherited a czar's ambition, end quote, of securing a sphere of influence along China's border. And third, and this is critical, Mao concluded that there were few alternatives in policy terms available to him at the time. In particular, Mao did not believe that the time was yet ripe for a rapprochement with the United States that China could use to kind of counterbalance against the Soviet Union. Yet the evidence available actually suggests, and this is both from archives that have been declassified on the Soviet side and the US side, essentially these 3 assessments were all inaccurate. First, the Soviet Union quickly escalated the conflict as a result of the ambush, counterattacking in the northeast later that month, and opening up another front in Xinjiang in August, as well as issuing veiled nuclear threats in the fall of 1969 that led Mao to evacuate Beijing. Second, there is actually little evidence from the Soviet records, including Brezhnev's own diaries, that the Soviet Union was contemplating any kind of preemptive attack on Beijing before the ambush. It was only, in fact, after the ambush that the Soviet leadership begins seriously considering any kind of military action. In other words, Mao ends up causing the outcome that he had hoped the ambush would try to prevent. And third, and this perhaps would be the most surprising to individuals, Mao misread the United States. So the archival records, despite what Henry Kissinger wrote in his memoirs, the archival records strongly suggest that as early as January and February of 1969, before the ambush occurs, Nixon was keenly interested in rapprochement with China. That is, Nixon was open to a healthy relationship, or a more warm relationship that Mao could have used as a counterbalance to the perceived threat that he had of the Soviet Union. Now, we might be tempted to think that these miscalculations were essentially inevitable. Again, our starting point is that the fog of war is thick, and our standard here is that institutions have to make it thicker than it otherwise would be. But there's actually considerable evidence to suggest that the story is not one in which Mao did the best he could with the information he had available at the time. Information was available within the Chinese bureaucracy that contradicted each one of Mao's judgments, but that information failed to reach Mao either because individuals were scared to relay it or because of functional failures. So, for example, Chinese diplomats appeared to have assessed that the international situation did not favor a Soviet invasion of China, but bureaucrats resisted supplying this information to the supreme leader, as noted by the four marshals in the spring of 1969, which is a really interesting thing we could talk maybe about more in the Q&A. But essentially, four very senior individuals from the Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry that had been recently taken out of their position said that, quote, it would be easier said than done to propose a different way of thinking, given the fact that Mao had already made his judgment, even though Mao was actually, in this case, requesting analysis from those individuals. Another helpful illustration of the functional impediments to information flow inside the Chinese state comes from this man here, Wang Guoquan, who replaced Wang Bingnan as the Chinese ambassador in Poland. Wang later noted that he had noticed changes in U.S. policy during the time that he was stationed in Warsaw. This is actually a couple of years before the 1969 events. But essentially what he's picking up on is, even within the Johnson administration, the last years of the Johnson administration, a willingness to entertain something akin to what becomes rapprochement between the United States and China. But Wang notes, however, and directly ties this back to the Cultural Revolution, that these signals that he was picking up on and relaying back to the Foreign Ministry headquarters were simply not picked up on by the leadership there, precisely because of the tumult associated with that particular moment in time. So to reiterate, the cases like the one that I just showed you are not the only way of studying miscalculation or the effects of institution on miscalculation. So in other parts of the book, I look at other case countries, as well as there's a cross-national data set which tries to explore this problem statistically. But this is sort of one illustration of how the theory might work. If you're interested, sort of outside of this book, there's certain things when you study decision making in China that are great. There are other things that you have limits on what you're able to know. So you might have sort of been wondering about the inner deliberations within those meetings that I was cataloging. So I try to explore advisory dynamics in other settings in research that came out last year in an article in International Organization. You might have been wondering sort of about, well, can you actually show systematically over time that information flows or reporting biases? I mean, I'm able to show you select events, but how do we know that this is a broader pattern? Again, in the content, if not the opportunity. So work I have with Eric Min tries to show this using a large corpus of diplomatic cables collected from the Foreign Ministry archives, again, statistically trying to show the ways in which information provision can be degraded over time. And then you might also be wondering, like, okay, your book is about bureaucracies, but where are the bureaucrats? They're helpful as illustrating cases, but this is largely a story in the sort of North and Weingast tradition about institution, about rules, about organizations, as opposed to individuals. I'm not trying to argue that individuals aren't important. So I have other work with Dan Mattingly, as well as one of our great graduate students, Yu Tong Li, that just came out in the China Quarterly. Actually, sorry, it's published in China Quarterly. And it published at AGPS. That kind of looks into the individual level dynamics as well. But that being said, I do think that there's something important to be said here about that conventional wisdom that this book kind of uses as its foil and starting point, which is this idea that pushing bureaucrats out of the room is the sort of road to more effective foreign policy decision-making. And I hope the talk today and some of the evidence that I was able to show you kind of leads you to rethink, as I did, the soundness of that claim and the contention of an alternative possibility that perhaps it's integrating bureaucratic actors into a decision-making process that is governed by certain institutions might actually help leaders avoid miscalculation in foreign policy decisions. So thanks so much for your time today. Glad to be here and happy to answer questions in the Q&A.